Welcome to Life, Death, and the Law, presented by the law firm of Beeson, Garner, and Hansen, hosted by attorneys Shawn Garner and Adam Hansen.
Good morning, Yuma. This is Life, Death, and the Law. I am Shawn Garner, an attorney with Beeson, Garner, and Hansen, in studio with my partner, Adam Hansen, and we are going to talk about exciting topics today. One is something that is a little bit worn out and tired, and it is the bailouts of these banks. We've got the Signature Bank bailout. We've got the Silicon Valley Bank bailout. And the question is this appropriate for the government to step in and choose winners and losers among banks and save them from poor decision-making and bail them out? Or is it good for the economy in general? Is it good to stabilize the banking system? Is everything going to fall apart if the federal government doesn't step in and do this? Or should we allow them to fail? So that's one question I want to address. Another question I want to address is the water issue. And you know that I'm passionate about the water, is specifically the Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin states, Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Nevada. And we're going to talk about what the Fed proposes to do with the shortage or alleged shortages that there are. And I say alleged because there's so much water right now in the mountains. It's at record levels. And so the water that's going to be coming downstream this year is going to be significant. And it still hasn't alleviated the fears of the drought and the mega drought that is being touted as the worst drought in a millennium. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I also want to talk about the college bailout. And I know that's been belabored as well, but I want to talk about some alternatives to the college bailout and something that might make a little bit more common sense. So that's our tactic, is common sense approach to real world problems that the government seems to create an even bigger issue out of somewhat solvable problem. So let's start with the college bailouts, because I think that's the easiest one. The big question here is whether or not Joe Biden had the authority to authorize the payoff of loans or the forgiveness of debt of college students who acquired debt between $10,000 and $20,000. Now, of course, the debt could be much higher than that, but the forgiveness was only between $10,000 and $20,000. So it was $20,000 if they'd received any Pell Grants from the government, and Pell Grants are based on income and financial means. And so if the student was determined at the time they received the loan to meet those standards, those requirements, then they could receive $20,000 worth of debt forgiveness. Now, of course, it's not debt forgiveness because the government doesn't own the debt. The government is only securing the debt. They're only on the hook to pay off the debt if the borrower doesn't pay it off. And so who is the federal government? That's us, the taxpayers. So we're on the hook for paying it off for the college students if they don't pay it off. And I suppose that's a good idea. I like the idea of encouraging people to go to school and making loans more available for them to go to school, as long as there's a cost-benefit analysis when they go to school and determine, hey, if I take out this $50,000 loan, am I going to be able to get a job that's going to be able to pay this off, or is it going to create more of a hardship for me than just going into the workforce and learning a trade? So if you don't have that cost-benefit analysis, you just go into take any risk you want, and somebody else is going to bail you out, you're going to make poor decisions. And so we're incentivizing poor decisions with all these bailouts. That's the conclusion. But working more through the theory here, think of a student that goes in and gets the student loan. When he initially applies, he or she applies for the loan, they look at financial eligibility. Primarily, students that have been living with their parents, they look at the financial eligibility of their parents. Now, after they've graduated, their parents, number one, might be in a significantly different circumstance financially, so they might not qualify for the Pell Grant. Number two, the students might not have qualified for this Pell Grant because they could be making a lot more money, having graduated and now obtained a degree and earning more money from that degree. But just because they earned or received money based on the Pell Grant, they're going to receive twice as much loan forgiveness as an individual who did not receive Pell Grant funds. That doesn't make any sense to me. Additionally, there already is a mechanism to assist people who get in over their heads because of either poor business decisions or excessive spending, or because life threw a curveball at them and now they're financially upside down. And that solution is something that Adam and I have practiced in for years. We don't currently do that, but we did initially early on in our careers, and that is bankruptcy. So bankruptcy has a stigma, and I want to address that just a bit here. When people get in over their head in debt, they become depressed. They lose all incentives to go to work because the debt keeps snowballing and they feel like there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And so the incentive for them to continue to work and be productive members of society is significantly reduced. So bankruptcy allows them to wipe out their debt, essentially start over. Now, lenders know that bankruptcy is an option, that if they lend so much money to an individual and that individual is unable to make good on paying off that debt, then they could lose their investment in that individual. And they charge interest based on the amount of risk that they assess to that individual. And so we have willing parties entering into contracts, understanding what the outcome is going to be, that there could be a bankruptcy at the end of the line here. And one thing that is not forgivable in bankruptcy, which is particularly notable on this topic, is student loans. Student loans are not forgivable in bankruptcy. I don't know why that is, but that is the law. And it seems as if you wanted to give debtors who were really just up to their eyeballs in debt, have done everything they can to work hard and to make a good living, but just life got the better of them and they couldn't do it, then you would allow that debt to be forgiven in bankruptcy. In fact, there is a rule, it's an exception, but in bankruptcy where if they have an excessive hardship, then they can have their student loans forgiven. However, it is rarely granted. I never saw it granted in all the bankruptcies that we filed. Adam, did you?
No, I've never seen it. I've never seen student debt discharged. In fact, the court usually will reprimand a person for even trying.
Right. They say you knew when you got into this that wasn't a forgivable debt. How hard is your hardship? How hard are you working? Are you able to do any type of repayment? Okay, well then we're gonna defer the loans for a certain period of time, but it's not going to be forgiven. That's the law. You knew it when you got into it, and we're not going to let you off the hook just because you don't get to buy the nice new car that you thought you deserved when you graduated college. So one option, instead of the president unilaterally going in there and forgiving student loan, would be to propose to Congress to change the bankruptcy laws. Bankruptcy laws are largely driven by federal law. Most states have their own bankruptcy laws and exceptions, and they also have the option to allow the debtors to elect the federal exceptions. And so when I say exceptions in there, that is property that the debtors can keep after they filed bankruptcy. For example, you can keep up to $150,000 in Arizona of equity in your home. That's the homestead protection. You can keep, I haven't been doing in the practice for a while, but it was at the time $5,000 worth of equity in a vehicle. I believe now it's more like $10,000. But you can keep that. You can keep $2,000 of cash, and you can also keep your Social Security payments, and you can also keep retirement that you've put away. You can also keep certain tax-deferred annuities that you've invested in for retirement purposes. So there are exceptions to what has to be liquidated to pay off the creditors when you file bankruptcy. And the creditors that get dismissed are credit cards and any unsecured debt. The secured debt, for example, the debt on your home, that's not going to be forgiven because you voluntarily offered your home as collateral to secure that debt. And that's whether it's a refinance or a purchase loan, an initially purchase loan. So those are all clearly constructed contracts that the creditor and the debtor entered into, and the court is going to enforce those contracts. An additional contract of that is student loans. Now, if a debtor came in and said, hey, listen, let's treat student loans like credit cards or an unsecured debt, because literally there is no security to it. I don't have my house or a car or anything that I'm using as collateral to secure that debt. And if I'm filing bankruptcy, then I do have a hardship. I'm going through the social stigma of the bankruptcy. You have to show up publicly at a hearing and state that you've disclosed all the assets that you own, and the creditors have the opportunity to cross-examine you and say, well, are you sure? Are you sure you don't have additional tools or, another hobby car or something else out there? And so it's something that it's not an easy process to go through, although it can create a fresh start and a really good opportunity for individuals that just are sinking and need some relief. So I believe that if Congress passed an additional bankruptcy reform that allowed student debt to be incorporated in there with the rest of debt, even clump it in with credit card debt, then that would be a much more reasonable approach than just wiping out $10,000 to $20,000 of debt of all these students who acquired it, regardless of what their financial need is. There is no financial requirement and hardship to be proven in order to get this debt relief. There is, in some sense, some financial eligibility because they have to show that they're not making over a certain amount of money. I believe if they're making over $120,000, then the debt relief is reduced, and over $250,000, and they don't get any debt relief. But you and I know that there are many professionals that can make a lot of money in reality and use a lot of benefits and live like millionaires, but show on their taxes that they don't actually make very much. Donald Trump is our perfect example of that. He's a billionaire, but on his taxes he makes very little. So the tax returns is not a very good indicator of whether or not you qualify for debt relief. I just think that if you truly do have a burden, well, then file bankruptcy, and let's allow that student debt to be clumped in as part of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is going to be the refiner's fire that's going to really determine if you do have a hardship.
I like that proposal because the alternative where you have a president or executive branch that says, well, I'm just going to unilaterally take all of your money, all those that pay taxes in the United States of America, and then pay off a certain portion, if not all, of student debt that's out there, that's akin to theft, in my opinion. We've talked about this before, the proper role of government in our lives, right? And if I can't go to my neighbor's house and say, hey, cough up $10,000 to $20,000 because I need to pay my other neighbor on the other side of us, he's got a lot of student debt. So I'm going to take $10,000 from you and I'm going to give it to him. I can't do that to my neighbor. So what allows the president or the executive branch to take my money that I pay in taxes and then pay off some other person that I don't even agree with or know their student debt? That's a weird concept to me. And if we were to do that, go door to door and ask people to cough up $10,000 to apply towards some random person's student debt, I doubt you'd get a lot of offers for that. I like the idea of private giving. We've talked about this before. Allow charitable people to come out and help with that, and that happens every day. And they don't get a lot of acknowledgement or even credit because it's not known. People around us that are giving or being charitable rarely want their name in the newspaper or want to be known what they're doing. Oftentimes they'll do it just because they want to pass on good throughout our society. So I would say what I would agree with you, Shawn, in the sense that to have an executive branch just unilaterally take care of debt and act like it's some great, gift to mankind, I think that's a little overreaching.
So let's get back to what was his incentive to do this, because he could have gone to Congress. Joe Biden is, the president we're talking about. He could have gone to Congress, and he could have gotten a law enacted that forgave student loans, or more appropriately, opened up the bankruptcy rules to allow student debt to be forgiven. He didn't do either of those. So what do you think his incentive was not to go to Congress, not to go through the proper means, even if, I don't agree with Congress necessarily taxing and choosing winners and losers, but only taxing for the purpose of, national defense and maintaining security of the state. However, it is what it is right now with taxation. So the appropriate means in the society that we live in right now, and the days and the times that we're living in, is Congress to make those rules. So the president doing, what was his incentive? What do you think?
Well, it's the akin to paying off voters. It's, I'm going to pay you.
The timing of it was pretty.
Pay you money in order to garnish your vote the next cycle, and that's what we've seen from this administration. I think since the get-go is. A lot of the action is based on perceived notion that if I do this for the voting base, then they're going to, again, vote for me, or this will bring them into our arena because we allowed for, no prosecution when a person crosses the border illegally. We pay off your debts, free everything. Everything's free. That's the mentality. It feels like, I don't know if that's, you asked my opinion, that's what it looks like. I think most people are aware of that. When they see things like what we're seeing, it's like, okay, that's an obvious move to garnish more votes the next election cycle.
So it's a political move. It's not that he has compassion for the students that are suffering from this overburdensome debt. It's just a political move to gain more votes.
What's interesting is if you were to look at these politicians that are putting in place or clamoring for these types of policy reforms or things that we would find pretty radical, if you look at them personally, I doubt they give hardly anything, and that's been proven over and over again, of charitable intent. Of their own money, they rarely give. But yeah, they're free to give of my money and your money, our taxpayer dollars. But when it comes down to them, if I were to go to them and say, hey, why don't you cough up $20,000 and give it to this guy to relieve his student debt, I doubt I'd have any takers in
Congress or
Congress
the presidency.
Yeah. And so it's easy to do these things when it's not their personal money. And you and I, Shawn, have both been in positions where we've had to oversee a purse of money. And when we do that, the fiduciary responsibilities that we have to that body that we are watching over that money for are extremely high. And you and I, we've talked about this before, we regard that as like, what would you call that? Sacred funds.
Absolutely.
You do not, that's not my money, and it's got a very specific purpose. And every cent, not dollar, every cent needs to be accounted for and shown to the public or whoever you're watching that for, so that they can do an audit at any time and make sure that everything's kosher, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. We have the Adult Protective Agency that will come and prosecute if we haven't properly not only used the funds for our beneficiaries' benefit, but actually give an accounting of how we use the funds. It's not enough to show that we didn't do anything bad. We have to show that we did everything right. And I think that's appropriate. We are entrusted with these funds for vulnerable individuals, and we have this high standard to use those funds appropriately, and we have to demonstrate that we did that. And I don't have any problem when I'm asked to give an audit for every dollar, every cent that has been spent, because I keep a good accounting of what the money is spent for. But why is this responsibility that is on me personally that has nothing to do with our national security and our national debt and bigger issues that our whole country faces? Why is that same level of responsibility not attributed to the president or Congress?
We got to go to break. This is Life, Death, and the Law, 560 AM KBLU.
More thought-provoking conversation coming up next on Life, Death, and the Law, right here after this. You're listening to Life, Death, and the Law, presented by Beeson, Garner, and Hansen, the law firm that has been voted Yuma's best 6 years in a row.
Welcome back. This is Life, Death, and the Law, 560 AM KBLU. I'm attorney Adam Hansen. I'm with my partner in crime, attorney Shawn Garner, and then we've got Cody Beeson as well in the studio today. In the last segment, we were talking a lot about solutions to the proposed forgiveness of student debt that the current administration has proposed, and Shawn's idea was, well, let's not just unilaterally forgive student debt with the wave of a wand, a magic wand, but rather let's use the system that we've already got in place, which would entail basically bankruptcy law. And Shawn mentioned, before, Shawn and I were in bankruptcy law. We did a lot there years ago. We don't practice in that anymore. However, it really set us up and gave us a good understanding, a foundation for the law that we practice today, which is estate planning. So when families come in and they sit down with us and we're able to put together plans, we're also able to look at creditor issues that might arise or might cause an issue down the road. And those recommendations that we have for a certain family are really derived from our knowledge of bankruptcy law from years ago. And so bankruptcy law, like Shawn mentioned before, is kind of a stigma out there, but in reality, it was created by the founders of our country, and
It's a social stigma if you say you filed bankruptcy, right?
But really, it's to start again. It's a new start, and you can do it as a business. You can do it as an individual. Most of the ones that we did, in fact, I think all of them, if I remember correctly, the bankruptcies that we filed were all Chapter 7 individual bankruptcies. We didn't get into when you get into corporate bankruptcy, it gets really sticky and nasty.
Yeah, Chapter 11 and Chapter 13 bankruptcies are very complex, and that's when a corporation wants to continue. An individual can file as well, but it's generally when you want to continue paying off the debts, but at a reduced amount. So right. the bankruptcy court will get a proposal from the debtor, and they'll consider, okay, everybody gets 40% of what they are owed, and this debtor is going to have an extended period of time to pay that 40% as opposed to pennies on the dollar, which would happen in a Chapter 7 liquidation bankruptcy.
And so the moral of this particular story is that what Shawn is saying, I wholeheartedly agree with you, having been in that world of bankruptcy before, that bankruptcy should be a better solution for what we're seeing in the student debt world. And the problem with that is currently bankruptcy law does not allow student loans to be forgiven. So that's one of the exceptions to bankruptcy is student loans, you've got taxes, you've got child support. So there's several exceptions to bankruptcy, meaning if I were to file bankruptcy and say, hey, I can't afford to pay all my debts, I need them wiped out, I need to start again, it's going to do a huge number on my credit, my credit score, right? But at the same time, it wipes out all these debts and clears all these debts out. Well, some of those that are not going to be cleared out are, at this point in time, as the current law states, taxes, back taxes that I owe. There's going to be student debt, student loans that I still have to pay. Those fly right through bankruptcy. They don't get discharged. And alimony, child support type payments. So there are several exceptions to the bankruptcy law. What I hear you say, Shawn, is let's just use the law that we've already got and tweak it a little bit to fit what needs to be done.
Number one, use Congress to actually change the law instead of having the president make laws. And then we already have a legal format in place, which is bankruptcy, that we can update if students are drowning in student loans to incorporate in the bankruptcy laws and make it doesn't have to be a blanket forgiveness. If they file bankruptcy, it could be demonstrate some type of hardship, which there already is a hardship exception in bankruptcy if you demonstrate that for student loans, but it's seriously difficult to meet those requirements, and I never saw one met in all the bankruptcies that I filed early on in my career.
And that's a perfect segue into the next topic that we want to talk about, and that was the banking crisis that we've seen with Silicon Valley Bank going under, and then a couple other banks going under recently. The proposal is, well, what we heard from the president's mouth is you don't have to worry. Anybody in that bank doesn't have to worry. We're gonna give all your money back, even if it exceeded the $250,000 FDIC insured limit that was put in place in 2010 through the Dodd-Frank legislation. in response to the 2008 crisis, the meltdown, the financial crisis. So during the Obama years, the Obama administration was able to push forward Dodd-Frank, which was increased regulatory structure on banks that want to participate in the FDIC system. So FDIC is an insurance body that if I'm a bank and I want to provide insurance to the extent that if I go under, my customers, they are going to be at least covered up to $250,000 for each depositor, each account in my bank, then I have to pay a certain fee to the FDIC to have federal backing there. And that's the way that would work. So it is possible for a bank not to be part of the FDIC system, but you and I, as customers of that particular bank, might be a little wary in the event of a financial meltdown that, hey, I'm banking with a bank that doesn't participate in the FDIC system. They don't have my back. If they go under, then there goes my money, basically. It's akin to investing in a stock that goes under and dies, and you don't get your money back. That happened to me once from experience. So it was a real good one, too. That's what my dad assured me. Oh, this is going to be the next big thing. I'm like, okay. So I put some money in there. Yeah, within like 6 months, it's bankrupt. And so I had a quick lesson in I thought surely my money would come back somehow.
However, that lesson was just that, a lesson. Are you more cautious about where you put your money now?
Yes.
And that's the whole point, right? Allow people to suffer the consequences of their actions, and you get an enlightened, a more cautious, a more trustworthy people. You save people, children, adults, it doesn't matter, from the consequences of their actions, and you get more reckless actions in the future. Is that what we want to incentivize? That's exactly what we're doing. I mean, we're incentivizing reckless behavior. We're incentivizing people to be very careless with their money and their investments, their depositors' money, and there's no consequences for it.
But why? Why do you say that?
Why do I say that? Because the federal government is coming in and bailing them out. They're not allowing the bank to fail. They're now not allowing the depositors to suffer the pinch of investing in a bank that is not financially sound or is not practicing financially sound services and investments. So that's what you want people to be free. That's what we want. We say freedom all the time. Now, freedom sounds good. It sounds like a word that, in my mind, a vision of running through a field of wheat and daisies. You know, you're free, but it's not.
Freedom, with clothes or without clothes?
Yeah, we're not going to get there. But it's accountability. Freedom is I get to choose what I get to do, and the consequences are on me. And so the federal government doesn't get to choose what I do. Nobody else gets to choose what I do, state government, local government. But when I make mistakes, I suffer the consequences of those mistakes. And that's how freedom works. And fortunately, we've demonstrated through this experiment of a free government that freedom allows innovation. And in fact, it not only allows innovation, but it incentivizes innovation. And we have had a more productive society and people in America over the past 200 years than ever in the history of the world because of freedom. But what we're doing right now is we're taking away a critical component of freedom, and that is accountability for our actions. We're not allowing for people to fail. And you can't take away the accountability without taking away the freedom itself. Because when we take away the accountability of the banks, then we are causing other individuals to pay for those mistakes. And when I have to pay for somebody else's mistakes, I no longer have the freedom to use my money as I choose. And when I have to pay for students that borrowed more money than they could pay back or are willing to pay back, then I have to pay for their bad decisions. That's not freedom. That's now me working as an indentured servant to the federal government so they can decide what to do with the production that I create.
I think freedom is synonymous with consequences, and that sounds stupid, but as I was thinking this thought through as you're talking, I'm thinking, with freedom comes, you have to be willing to accept the consequences. And consequences, I think, often that word alone, it kind of imbues negativity, but it's not always a negative consequence. If I go to the gym every morning and I work hard and I eat right, then the consequence of that is a good consequence, that my body should be toner, I should be more healthy, right? But if I sit on the couch every day and eat potato chips and watch TV for hours and hours, then that's probably going to have a negative consequence on my body. So freedom is synonymous with consequences. And I feel like the government has this idea that they are trying to, and rightfully so. I mean, the government's job, in its opinion, I guess, is to protect us, right? I would argue that they're supposed to be protecting us from foreign powers invading and blowing us up.
And domestic terrorists.
Sure.
Individuals who want to take away our life or our property. They should have police forces that protect against that.
But it comes in the name of locking everything down. So we're going to protect you financially by creating this banking system that also has an insurance policy that backs everything up, because we know it's for your own good and we don't want you to get harmed, kind of thing. Sometimes, and those of you that have kids have experienced this, when you have a kid and they start to walk, one of the most detrimental things you can do to that child is to help them walk. They have to fall. They have to get up, stumble, fall, hurt themselves a couple times, even when they're learning to ride a bike. Through that process of trial and error and hurt, they begin to learn the mechanics of walking and riding a bike. And that principle goes throughout our whole life, no matter if you're a little infant or you're an adult in the banking world. You have to learn the idea or the consequences of your actions somehow. And if you have a government that's constantly there to get your back and to bail you out, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of myself as a parent to my own kids and how I probably should change my parenting ways.
Step in when they make mistakes.
Yeah. And that's detrimental to their progress, right? I try not to be that parent. I know you're pretty good at it, Shawn. You're better than I am. I'm not a very good parent, but I try not to step in and solve my kids' problems. But it's hard. It's hard when you see them hurting, right? And so the government, I mean, I think that's the contra argument to what you're saying is that, well, we're here to protect you, and we know better than you because we have these agencies that we put in place and all these experienced professionals that know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and therefore we know you're inevitably going to make some stupid decision, but we want to protect you. So
yeah, and unfortunately, all the people in those administrations or most come from academia, and in academia they practice on theory, and that's not real life. Real life shows what actually works. You can have a theory of how wheat should grow, but you're not going to really know unless you're out there planting it, irrigating it, weeding it, and then harvesting it at the end of the year and doing it year after year to see what actually works. So we have these theorists that are running the government and the people that are actually producing out in the rest of the country, and we're being governed by people that don't really have real life experience as to how things work, and that's the major downfall. We've got to take a break. This is 560 AM KBLU.
More thought-provoking conversation coming up next on Life, Death, and the Law, right here after this. You're listening to Life, Death, and the Law, presented by Beeson, Garner, and Hansen, the law firm that has been voted Yuma's best 6 years in a row.
Welcome back. This is Life, Death, and the Law. I'm Shawn Garner, attorney with Beeson, Garner, and Hansen. We do estate planning, and we are in no way qualified to talk about water, but we're going to do it anyway. So, Adam, we have a field that is surrounding our building, at least to the north and to the east of us. It's a beautiful alfalfa field at some seasons. They plant other crops during other seasons, and there's sheep in the field at times as well. And I love it. I love driving up to our office and seeing that land in production. In fact, I know the farmer personally that is farming that land. The owners of the land are not the farmers of the land. I know that for a fact. And right now, we've got this issue with the Colorado River where there's less water flow than there is people taking withdrawals and using through irrigation and watering their crops from the river. So there's a problem. And it's not, in my mind, it's not as catastrophic as it looks from looking at Lake Mead and looking at Lake Powell, where they're down 75%, because the river flow is not down 75%. And when you just look at those large reservoirs, it would lead to that conclusion. But rather the conclusion is we're taking out 10, maybe even 5% more water than there is coming down the river. And so the reservoirs are consistently going down. And what we need to do is take the same amount that is coming through the rivers. We don't need to take less than is flowing in the rivers, because then the reservoirs would be overflowing and there would be flooding. So how much less flow is there in the rivers? In the past 20 years, they say that this is a historical drought. It's a mega drought. And they use these terms for shock and awe factor because it sells. Terror sells more efficiently than good news or even accurate news. And so it's about 10% less over the past 20 years that the river is flowing than it had been. And when you look at going back 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, through measuring the rings on the trees, you can determine what the water flow was. And they've been fairly accurate, at least as far as I know. I'm not a scientist, in determining that on average there's about 17 million acre-feet of water flowing down the Colorado River. But the problem is we've allocated all of that, and we haven't addressed for evaporation. We haven't addressed for seepage, into the ground and other issues where we can't actually allocate all that 17 million acre feet. Really what we can allocate is about 14 million acre feet. And so what we need to do is proportionately, the states have apportioned who gets what water through several compacts. And in the upper Colorado River Basin states, they've decided Utah gets a certain portion, Colorado gets a certain portion, Wyoming gets a certain portion. And if there's less water to apportion out, then everybody proportionately reduces their share. That makes absolute sense to me. In fact, it's so easy that I think that a fifth grader would come up with that solution as the very first one out of the gate. However, in Arizona and California, New Mexico, and Nevada, we have this very complicated system where if there's a shortage in water, Arizona takes the first big brunt of the hit. And then Nevada takes a brunt, then New Mexico takes it, then Mexico, which we have to allow 1.5 million acre feet to go to Mexico as well, they take it. And last is California. And until Arizona has actually taken a 50% reduction in its water allocation, California will not take any significant percent. And that's currently California's proposal. The federal government said the river is being overtaxed right now. It's being overused. And so the reservoirs are dropping so low that we can't use them for what they were intended for, which is, number one, to provide water in dry years, and number two, to provide clean power through the hydroelectric generators in the dams. And so we need to allow those reservoirs to refill. So you can't be taking out as much water. Well, Arizona and Colorado and Utah and Wyoming and all the other 6 states got together and said, okay, well, we have to account for the evaporation that is occurring, and it's about 1.5 million acre feet of evaporation. So what we've done is we've allocated water that we're really not getting. It's not going downstream, and it's not being caught in the reservoirs. It's evaporating in the air, or it's sinking down into the ground. And so we have to account for that, and we have to reallocate our apportionments between the states. And so Arizona and all the other 6 states said we're going to reapportion it proportionately for the amount of water that we've agreed with in our compacts. And California said, no, absolutely not. We're not going to, number one, acknowledge that there's 1.5 million acre feet that we did not account for evaporating, and we're not going to take a bigger cut. We're not going to take a proportional cut. We will reduce our share by only 400,000 acre feet. And when you count that to 4 million acre feet is what they get. They get 4.2 million acre feet. That's nothing. And they want Arizona eventually to take a 50% reduction in its share of the allocation from the Colorado River before they'll even take a 13% reduction. And so California just really isn't willing to budge. They're not willing to cooperate, but they're such a political giant in the national political field that when the feds come in, they're unwilling to cross California. So instead of saying, California, hold on, what's going on in California right now? Record snowfall in the mountains, record rainfall in the valleys. All of your reservoirs are nearly at 100%. Several of your reservoirs are over 100%. Lake Oroville is letting water out. Folsom Lake is letting water out to prepare for the excessive runoff that is going to be coming down from the mountains. You have water and to spare in your own reservoirs. Plus, you've had a $40 billion bond that was created in 2014 to create the Sites Dam and Reservoir, which you have not built to allow more water conservation and preservation for dry seasons. So California, not only do you have enough water, but you've failed to take steps to allow for more reasonable and efficient allocation of your resources. Arizona is using every drop of water that it gets. And so it needs to be more efficient and look for technology to be more efficient for its crops, which it's constantly doing, but it can't create more water. It can't actually store more water because it's not receiving any. So you have to look at where the solutions lie. And California should know that of all people because they look at, hey, there's a disparity in the income gap, and so we need to tax the rich more than the poor, and we need to reallocate wealth. But they're unwilling to do it with water. I don't understand how that concept doesn't cross over to the fields here, but it doesn't. Either way, the feds are going to step in, and one of the proposals of the feds is to pay the farmers to not use their fields, and that's called fallowing your fields. When you don't use your fields for crop production, you're fallowing your fields. And they actually haven't come down yet with a specific dollar figure, but it's anywhere between $500 per acre foot of water to $1,500 per acre foot of water. Now, if you get to $1,500 per acre foot of water, a traditional field, like a wheat field, might have 5 acre feet of water. So if for each acre of land that it has, that's water 5 feet tall. That's how much allocation it would receive from the Colorado River a year to grow its wheat during certain seasons, alfalfa during other seasons. So it's feeding both for human consumption and for cattle and for goats and sheep and all other types of livestock that eat that. And so that's what they're offering these farmers to receive to not produce. Now, what happens if the federal government gives that money for them not to produce it? Number one, where does the money come from? Federal government doesn't make any money. They take it from us. So it comes from the taxpayers to pay these farmers not to produce. Then what happens? Well, oftentimes, as with the case with the land right around our building, the farmers don't own the land. Landowners are not the farmers. So the landowners, they get that $1,500 per acre foot, and the farmers who are actually planting the seeds, irrigating, weeding it, and then harvesting it and paying all the people to harvest and the truck drivers to go and to take the produce to the coolers and then to ship it across the country to the grocery stores where we buy it, or the restaurants where we eat it, or the cattle farms where the cattle are fed with the hay. All of those people in between are out of work. So you got the truckers are out of work. You got the restaurants where the truckers stop, they're out of work. You got the grocery stores that are having to hike up the prices. And at the end, we've got higher prices for groceries, higher prices when we go out to restaurants. So you go out to restaurants less often. So you got people working at restaurants, and you got restaurants going out of business. All of this has a trickle-down effect, and it's all negative. Then you look at the field itself. When a field is in production, when water is being poured on it, instead of allowing to pass through and go into the ocean, which California is doing. It's pumping 4 million acre-feet of water out of the Colorado River, and then it's letting its own water come down from its mountains and flow right into the ocean. So instead of allowing the water to go in the ocean, we're saying, let's put it on our land, and let's allow that land to stay fertile, and so it doesn't turn into dust and blow off and become totally desolate. That seems like a pretty good idea to me. Don't let the cattle starve. Don't let the people go hungry and inflation skyrocket. Let's let the water not flow into the ocean and put it on the land instead and keep everybody employed. But apparently, that is not a good idea for some reason, and the federal government wants to pay landowners not to produce. That to me it's on par for what the federal government's decisions are, and that means absolutely idiotic. Let the landowners figure it out. Proportionately reduce the amount of allocation that they are receiving so we can get to stability and allow the reservoirs to fill back up so we can have this clean hydroelectric electricity, which California uses a lot of, and we can have consistency with the producers that allow our economy to thrive and allow us to have food on our tables and allow us to feed the animals that participate in the great environment that we live in. That's all the time that we have for today. This is Life, Death, and the Law, 560 AM KBLU.
If you have questions or want to know more about something that was discussed today, please call the law firm of Beeson, Garner, and Hansen at 928-783-4575 or visit yumaestateplanning.com.